Good evening, everyone. This is Land for Peace Part 2, Counterpoint. Last week, we had seen a tshuva from Volume 10 from Rabbi Yosef Shlita, still going strong, incredibly, and amazingly, really, truly one of the Gedolei Yisrael today, and who wrote an essay that he said at the very outset was academic in nature because on a practical level we really don't have partners for peace. And therefore he started off his tshuva by saying that if we had partners for peace and the Arabs would be satisfied with merely just land for peace, and they would acknowledge that we have a state and we could get along peacefully by giving them certain parcels of the West Bank, of the Shtachim. He says that there's what to talk about on a practical basis, but he says that that's not the reality. And furthermore, he says that a number of different both military and political experts differ in their views as to whether giving land for peace is prudent and is the key to peace with the Arabs or not. And therefore he was very careful to detail that this is academic and this is not a practical shaila. Here's what's interesting, and this was brought to my attention by Baron Dasberg, who mentioned this to me, that shortly after this, a few years, maybe 3 years after this was published, was Oslo in 1993. And many leading political figures used Rav Ovadiah's tshuva as a basis for approving and endorsing what was taking place at the Oslo Accords. And it's perhaps possible that Rav Ovadiah himself was complicit in this. It's not clear. I don't remember historically what took place. I didn't research it carefully to see what Rav Ovadiah's role, if there was any role that he took. And so, even though he does very clearly detail that the discussion is academic, there seems to have been some practical use of his tshuva. We find the same being echoed by Rav Shaul Yisraeli Zichrono Livracha in the opening of his tshuva that appears in the very same volume of Tchumen, volume 10, regarding his feeling that it's necessary for him to respond to Rav Ovadiah's, he had heard it originally as Torah Shebal Peh, as a drasha, and later it was published, but he felt it was necessary to respond to the arguments that Rav Ovadia Yosef had put forth, because, for the very reason that this line of halachic discussion could not be contained purely in an academic, ethereal realm, but if it did not have a legitimate response, then it was going to be transferred into the political and physical realm. So if you take a look, we're just going to read his opening statement, which appears in Tchumen sort of almost like a footnote. And Rav Shaul Yisraeli was the Rosh Yeshiva of Mosad Rav Kook Yeshiva, and he was a very, very prominent figure in the religious Zionist world in Eretz Yisrael. Anyone ever learn under Rav Yisraeli? Anyone ever hear Shiur from Rav Shaul Yisraeli? I don't know if there's anyone here. I never had the zuchus, but you have this. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at what he writes. He says, "Misima lo ni'ima natalti al atzmi." He says, I have placed sort of an unpleasant task upon myself. Latzeit b'vikuach im yididi oz mishekavar hayamim, to enter into a debate with my dear and old friend Hagaon Rabbi Ovadia Yosef Shlita, Rishon LeZion v'Rosh Chachmei Torah, the chief Sephardic rabbi and one of the heads of wisdom, of the wise rabbis. V'asher lahachrazato be'ozni shalit mitzarim, that what has come to my attention, what has been brought to my attention, is very, very painful. Shechazar aleha bebisus halachti bekenes l'Torah sheba'al peh shel Masad Rav Kook b'chodesh I guess it's Tafshin Nun Aleph Ishtakad, or B'chodesh. I'm not sure what that abbreviation. Ishtakad, that was Menachem Av. You're probably right. B'chodesh Menachem Av Ishtakad. Last Menachem Av, that he gave a shiur in Yeshivas Mosad Rav Kook. Ubali Adi Pirsum Rav B'Tikshot Klapei Panim Uklapei Chutz. That there was a lot of publicity and a lot of fanfare that was made around this, both internally and to the public outside of our community. Shebiglal pikuach nefesh yeshlum sor bidei bnei hanechar hayoshvim ba'aretz chavalim shleimim eretz Yisrael. That for the sake of saving lives, because as the way that the she'ela was presented is that by giving back land we can avert war with the Arabs, and so by giving whole parcels of land back, we can save lives. It was the way that the issue was presented. Halalu hayeduan b'shem Yehuda, Shomron ve'Aza, pieces of land that are known as Yehuda, Shomron, and Gaza, Yesha, as we call them, which is no longer because we've given away Gaza. Shahayu tachat shilton hayardenim, that originally this was under Jordanian rule. V'nichbeshu bidei tzahal b'milchemet sheishet hayamim b'derech nes v'hashkacha elyona. And during the 6-day war, it was conquered by the Israeli army in a miraculous fashion. V'im ki hitna et zeh b'tnai kaful. And it's true that Rav Ovadia, in the outset of his remarks, was very, very clear to qualify his words. Sheyezeh shalom emet l'dat mumachim tzvayim u'mediniyim. That it has to, the whole, you can only justify giving land if all of the mumchim, all of the experts, the political and the military experts say that this is for sure going to bring peace. Uchafisha amar be'atzmo, adayin hadavar achok. And as Rav Ovadia himself said, this is not a practical issue because this is not going to bring peace with the Arabs that we're dealing with today. V'kayamim chilukei deot ben hamumchim atzmam benidon. And today, the experts argue with each other as to what the correct path to take is. Ach etzem hashma'at hadvarim kevar hispika lahatil mevucha b'tzibur. However, nonetheless, his words have already begun to create a big problem within the Jewish community. Bifrat b'tzibur shomer haTorah, especially in the Orthodox community, the Dati community, ha'me'unyan lishmo divrei chachamim, who want to follow the words of the sages. V'chein nishmu bikvot divarav hatzaharot mafligot mipi kama sarim hamityarim lomar shemashmim zot v'hishamaot lepisko. And we've also heard that a number of members of parliament and members of government are actually quoting Rabbi Ovadia as the basis for wanting to go into peace accords, and are using his psak as saying, look, even Rabbi Ovadia says that this is the right path to take. That we are prepared to give back the territories because of what Rabbi Ovadia says, of course, ignoring the preamble that he was so careful to lay forth. I guess it's mekach umemkar. Masa, right. That this is something that it weakens our position before we get into any kinds of preconditions, any type of negotiation. Because if we've already entered into negotiation with a given that we're going to give back territory, then that weakens our position in negotiating with the Arabs. Once it's become public that we're about to give back land. It also strengthens the hands of the leftists, that their whole objective is to reduce the size of the Medina, they want to tarnish or to some way diminish the distinction of the nation of Israel and the uniqueness of Eretz Yisrael. Uv'miyuchad einam tzara b'hitnachaluyot asher tzatzu me'az milchemet sheshet hayamim ba'otam shtachim. And these leftists are especially derisive of the shtachim, the areas that were conquered during the Six-Day War. Vehikimu yishuvim lemofet, and people who have established settlements in those areas. Mibli shenagu ki hu zeh b'yishuvei am hanecha. Despite the fact that these settlements have not infringed at all on any Arab communities, on any Arab villages. And we know that. We know that there are plenty of communities that are in the Shtachim that do not infringe on Arab lands, do not infringe on Arab villages, and yet the leftists say that this is the impediment to peace. V'chol mishum or masos libam le'okrami mekomam, and their whole objective is to uproot these places and to get rid of them completely. Me'achar lachar iyun shurata halacha mechayevet she'en lehichana lelachatz ule'iyumei milchama limsor b'dei nochim shtochim me'eretz Yisrael. And after my investigation and analysis, the halacha demands us to conclude that no, we should not buckle under the pressures and the threats of war to give back territory to non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael, bifrat halalu hamiyushavim b'idei Yehudim, especially not after those places have been settled by Jews. And therefore, amarti lechavot et da'ati barabim, and therefore I wanted to publicize the way I paskin. V'torah dichtiv ba'emet lo tira chas v'sholom kekantranut, and may the Torah, which is written with an emet, should not be seen as kantranut, as trying to create divisiveness. V'kuyam banu et vahev b'suva kedarshatam zal v'emet v'hashalom ehavu. That a person has to love peace and truth. So that his hope is that this will not create machlokes, but rather will create a sense of harmony and peace. Okay, I just want to, before we go into the sources of Rav Yisraeli, I want to make sort of my just my observation, and I'm trying to be as non-political, sort of trying to be as objective as I can. While my sympathies lie more with Rav Yisraeli's arguments, I found the way that Rav Ovadia had presented his essay much more appealing to the halachic thinker. I'm just saying that at the outset because I found it much more difficult to get through Rav Yisraeli's article because this article echoes the voice of an impassioned speaker who has difficulty divorcing his deep, deep emotional attachment to Eretz Yisrael from the cold facts, just the facts man. Whereas Rav Ovadia Yosef was able to present a classic tshuva, argument by argument, subject by subject, excising all the fat and the schmaltz and everything, and presenting us the cold conclusion, the way he presents it of the halachic findings. Rabbi Yisraeli does that throughout his tshuva as well, but interspersed within these arguments are sort of like a man getting up and saying, how can you do that? How can you even think such a thing? And it's therefore much more difficult for someone who wants to try and look at this analytically and objectively to be able to get through Rabbi Yisraeli's arguments. And I find that unfortunate because I think Rabbi Yisraeli's arguments, when you try to whittle them down into their basic presentation, had they been presented a little bit differently, it's a much more convincing argument. So we're going to try and distill through and just look over the sources that he presents with the understanding that I'm not going through all of the, what I would call some rhetoric that appears interspersed within the tshuva. Okay? So Rabbi Yisraeli begins, and a lot of his, I would say the majority of his tshuva is really a rejoinder to Rav Ovadia Yosef. Is a response and showing it polemicizes against Rabbi Ovadia's tshuva. So we'll hearken back to what Rabbi Ovadia had said from last week. We had seen the Ramban as well last week. We're just going to review it very, very briefly. The Ramban, who writes a commentary to the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvos, to the Rambam's listing of all of the mitzvahs of the Torah, he writes that the Rambam left out one mitzvah saseh. He calls that mitzvah saseh number 4. And the mitzvah saseh number 4 that the Rambam left out in his counting of the 248 mitzvah saseh was the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And if you'll recall, what Rav Ovadiah's primary argument was that while he accepts the Ramban's psak, we have to appreciate the fact that, number one, the Rambam does not paskin that way. The Rambam holds that Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not a mitzvah, at least not bisman hazeh. And the reason why Rabbi Ovadiah argues that the Ramban's categorization of this as a mitzvah does not apply bisman hazeh was because of the famous Gemara in Ksuvas Daf Kuf Yud Aleph, that one of the oaths that HaKadosh Baruch Hu imposed upon the Jewish people of the diaspora is Shelo Ya'alu Bachoma, that the Jewish people may not enter en masse into Eretz Yisrael to flood Eretz Yisrael before the time of the redemption has arrived. And as a result, there can no longer be a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as long as that oath is binding upon the Jews of the diaspora. But if you recall, the Ramban in his language seems to disagree with that, because the Ramban in his language seems to say that this mitzvah is extant in every generation. And we start with just the very few words, and then we'll skip around in the Ramban, but it's the Ramban in source number 1 says, Mitzvah Revius Shenitztavinu Lareshes Haaretz. We've been commanded to inherit the land. Asher Nasan Hakel Yisparach V'Yisrael Alavosenu Li'Avram Li'Yitzchak U'Li'Yakov. The land that Hashem gave to our forefathers. V'lo na'azva b'yad zulatenu min ha'umos u'lishamama. That we are not allowed to forsake it for others, for other nations, or to leave it just fallow. V'hu amro lahem. And where is that mitzvah contained in the Torah? V'horashtem es ha'aretz v'yishavtem ba, ki lochem nasati es ha'aretz lareshes osa v'hisnachaltem es ha'aretz. That you shall inherit the land and you shall dwell in it, because to you have I given the land to inherit, and you shall pass this along as an inheritance. And the Ramban points out that this mitzvah appears in multiple places in the Torah, and he continues along and he says, and if you go to the place where it's underlined, he says, just go up one line above that, where the Ramban says as follows. He says, V'al tishtabesh v'tomar. Don't confuse yourself by thinking. Ki ha-mitzvah hazot si ha-mitzvah b'milchemes shiva amimim shenitztavu la'avdam. That this commandment to inherit the land only applies to wage war with the 7 nations that we originally encounter when we go into Eretz Yisrael, those indigenous 7 nations, and that once we've obliterated those nations, there's no longer a mitzvah. This idea of milchemes mitzvah. He says, Shenemar achareim tacharimein, that the Torah says you shall utterly wipe them out. He says, Ein hadavar kein. That's not true. Sha'anu nitztavinu laharog ha'umos hahem behilachamam imanu, that we have a mitzvah, we have a commandment to kill those nations who wage war with us in Eretz Yisrael. V'imratzu lahashlim nashlim imahem v'no ozveim. And if they desire to make peace, we will make peace with them, and then we will leave them alone. We will allow them to live on the land. B'tanaim yuduim, with known conditions, which we saw last week in the Rambam, who talks about the necessity to make the nations who wish to live among us become Gerei Toshav. And a Ger Toshav is someone who accepts upon himself Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. Aval ha'aretz lo naniach osa biyadam, v'lo biyad zulasa min ha'umos b'dor min hadoros. But what's clear from the language of the Ramban is that we are not allowed to forsake the land and allow it to remain in the hands of any other nation in any generation. And if you skip If you skip down to the next underlined section, he says, Va'omer ani, I say, Ki ha-mitzvah shehachachamim mafligim ba v'hidiras Eretz Yisrael. I say that the mitzvah that the Chachamim heap praise upon, in other words, emphasize, which is the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael ad she'amru shekol hayotzi mimena v'dar b'chutz la'aretz yehei beinecha k'oved avodah zarah, that anyone who lives outside of Eretz Yisrael should be considered in your eyes like an idolator. Shene'emar ki gereshuni hayom mihistapech b'nachal as Hashem l'morlech avod Elohim acherim. As we learned last week, that King David says that by dint of the fact that I've been forced out of Eretz Yisrael, it's like I'm worshipping idols. And all of the other emphases that Chazal place upon the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, who mitzvahs aseh hazeh, shenitztavinu l'reshes haaretz v'lo sheves ba. It is an outshoot of this mitzvahs aseh that I'm telling you that the Rambam missed, that we have an obligation to inherit the land and to live there. Im kaini mitzvahs aseh l'doros. And therefore it is a positive commandment for every generation, and mischayiv kol yachim imenu, and every individual is obligated to take this mitzvah upon himself or herself, va'afilu bizman golus, and even in the times when we're in golus, ki yadua b'talmud b'makamos harbe, as is apparent in the Gemara in a number of places, that sages who were living in Bavel remembered Eretz Yisrael and began to cry. Now, just to review, because we also saw last week a tshuva of the Rashbash, who was a 14th century, actually 15th century, descendant of the Ramban. And like 4 generations, a great-great-grandson. And he qualifies the Ramban's tshuva, and we had seen Rabbi Ovadia quote that qualification. The Rashbash's qualification is based on the following Gemara, that there are 3 times where it says in Shir Hashirim, Hishbati Eschem, that I impose an oath upon you. And what are those 3 Shavuot? What are those 3 oaths? So the Gemara asks this, and it says, Echa shelo yalu Yisrael b'choma. One is that the Jewish people may not go up like a wall into Eretz Yisrael, en masse is the way it's usually translated. The Echas, a second oath, is Shehishbia Kodesh Baruch Hu es Yisrael, Shelo Yimradu Be'umos ha'olam. That the second oath is that the Jewish people may not rebel against the nations within the diaspora. That if you have a Jewish community, a Jewish community may not rebel, do an uprising against other nations in which they live. We have to be polite neighbors. We have to be polite diaspora Jews. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would obviously not be restricted by this oath. When they're trying to kill us, this does not apply.
Isn't that the point of the third one, though?
Ve'echad, and the third one is Shehishbia Kodesh Baruch Hu es ha'ovdei kochavim shelo yishtabdu bahen b'Yisrael yoser midai. This oath is placed upon the other nations, that the other nations who are captor nations may not subjugate us excessively to the point where we're forced to have that sense of rebellion.
Wasn't that breached?
Yeah, of course. Well, when that's breached, so then you can breach the other. Yeah, okay. Now, before we take a look at Rashi, let's take a look at the Shuta Rashbash in source number 4. Shuta Rashbash Siman Bet, which we saw briefly yesterday. He says there's no question that the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is a great mitzvah. It applies whether the temple is standing or not. And my great Zaidi, the Ramban, counts it as one of the 613 mitzvahs. And he says that even the Rambam, who does not count it as a mitzvah, there are 2 approaches, by the way, as to why the Rambam does not count it as a mitzvah. There may be more, but the 2 primary approaches are either because the Rambam considers Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a prerequisite to many, many other mitzvahs, all the mitzvahs hatchluyos ba'aretz, and as a result does not consider it to be its own isolated mitzvah, but more like an act that leads to the performance of other mitzvahs, but is no less obligatory. That's one approach to the Rambam. In other words, the Rambam agrees that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael applies nowadays, but it is subsumed as sort of like a macro mitzvah, which doesn't need to be enumerated as one of the 613 mitzvot. And the other approach of the Rambam is that because of this oath, the Rambam feels that that while it was originally a mitzvah, but once we were sent into Golus, the mitzvah does no longer extant. Yes?
Doesn't the Rambam also hold it a mitzvah to conquer the land of Israel?
Well, no, he doesn't count it as a mitzvah to conquer the land of Israel.
Live in the land, but to actually conquer the land.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't recall that is one of the 613, but I may be mistaken. But the point is that it's certainly not one of the 613 that he counts in the Sefer HaMitzvahs. He does say, of course, in a few places in the Mishnah Torah, that the Jews are supposed to go in and conquer the land. And once they've conquered the land, they have a number of things to do, to set up a king, to destroy Amalek, to build the Beis HaMikdash. Yeah? But he doesn't count it as one of the 613 mitzvahs in his Sefer HaMitzvahs. But let's take a look at the Rashbash at the end of his tshuva, this underlined section. Omnam mitzvah zu eina mitzvah koleles l'chol Yisrael begalus hachel hazeh. This mitzvah is not inclusive of every single Jew. In other words, not every Jew does this mitzvah apply to. Aval him nimnaas klal kishachazal begemar ksuvos perka acharon shehi michlal shvuos shishbiya kodesh baruch hu es Yisrael lo yemaharu es haketz v'shlo yalu b'choma. There is sort of like a something pulling back on this mitzvah. The mitzvah sort of denied all of Klal Yisrael when Chazal said that there's an oath that says that we may not go en masse to Eretz Yisrael. And therefore there's no possibility that this mitzvah could be imposed upon all of the Jewish people. And go and see what happened to the Bnei Ephraim, that they tried to leave Egypt and go to Eretz Yisrael prematurely. Before Hashem told Moshe to take them out, there were some Bnei Ephraim who pushed their way out, as we're going to read in a couple of weeks in Parshas B'Shalach, at the beginning of Parshas B'Shalach, V'lo nacham Elokim derech eretz Plishtim ki karovu. And Hashem did not allow the Jewish people to travel directly out of Egypt and pass through the Philistine territory. And as Targum Yonasan says over there, it's because Hashem didn't want them to see the remains of their brethren from Shevet Ephraim who had left a couple of decades earlier and were unsuccessful, that they had gone out before the allotted time. So the Rashbash says that this is the way it is. When Jews are in Golus, we have to wait until Hashem tells us to go back to Eretz Yisrael, if we're going to leave as a community. Omnam mitzvah al kol yachid lalos ladur sham, but every individually you have to ask yourself, can I fulfill this mitzvah? And therefore, if I have circumstances that prevent me from going, then I'm putter from going because it's on the individual and not on the nation. And therefore, if I feel that I'm part of that group where the oath still applies to, that segment of Klal Yisrael, to whom the oath still applies of Shelo Yalu B'Choma, I'm allowed to count myself among those who are not going to go up, and I'll leave it for someone else to go. And he says it's on that basis that even people who live in Eretz Yisrael have a right to leave Eretz Yisrael in order to get married, in order to study Torah. So the Rashbash, even though he says that the Ramban is correct, that there is a mitzvah on individuals to live in Eretz Yisrael, says that every individual has a right to exempt himself by saying, I choose to be part of the public, or the larger grouping of Klal Yisrael that are remanded from going up to Eretz Yisrael because we're not allowed to go up B'Choma. But if an individual says, I want to fulfill the mitzvah, there's no question that he fulfills a mitzvah saseh, one of the Taryag mitzvahs of the Torah. So Rabbi Yisraeli just points out that even if you learn like the Rashbash, you still fulfill the mitzvah of Kibush Eretz Yisrael by taking possession of any piece of Eretz Yisrael. Even though you could argue that there's no obligation for the Jews to go en masse to Eretz Yisrael, but if an individual says, I'm going to go, and he wants to live in the Shtachim, so the place where he's living is the mitzvah of Kibush Eretz Yisrael. And furthermore, we have to look very carefully, says Rabbi Yisraeli, at Rashi on that Gemara. Rashi on that Gemara says that the oath of Shelo Yalu Bachoma, I had just translated as Bachoma, is Anmas. But Rashi explains it slightly differently. Rashi says, if you take a look at source number 3, Shelo Yalu Bachoma, Yachad Biyad Chazaka. Rashi says two things. Yachad is Anmas, and what? Biyad Chazaka, forcefully. Forcefully. So the Avnei Nezer, who lives in the 19th century, the Sugya Shiur Rebbe, says something very important. The Sugya Shiur the Avnei Nezer has a very long tshuva at the end of his tshuvas in Yoredeya, all about the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And one day it may be worthwhile to go through different segments. He must have about 60 different paragraphs itemizing various different issues regarding whether the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael applies Bizman Hazeh. And he's speaking in the late 19th century, where there's a great Chovevei Tzion movement. There's a great invigoration of the Zionist ideal, even among some from a Yidden. And he's therefore asked whether or not there's a mitzvah for Jews to go to Eretz Yisrael and live there. And in the course of his tshuva, he writes in paragraph 56, he says, Ivra d'chol zehu rak she'en lo reshus mehamemshala la'alot. He says the only time where a person is commanded shelo yalu bachoma, not to go up, and like the Gemara had said, is only when the government says that you shouldn't go, because then you're going forcefully. Aval im hisig reshus la'alos lihisyashev shama. But if you receive permission, if the government grants you permission, shuv mechuyav la'alos, then you have the mitzvah now of making aliyah. Deme'ata leka hatam dechol b'lesa b'tzibur lesa b'yachid. He says he had gone through a whole long argument before that if the Jewish people as a whole cannot be obligated to make aliyah, then an individual cannot be obligated to make aliyah. But once the government gives you permission, then this idea of the masses no longer can no longer fulfill the mitzvah no longer applies. That if the Jewish people are granted permission to immigrate to Eretz Yisrael en masse, then there's no longer the oath of Shelo Yalu B'choma. Now this is a very big chiddush. That Shelo Yalu B'choma, as Rashi says, means forcefully. So if there's no longer a disobedience involved in going en masse to Eretz Yisrael, because the international community says, Jews, go back to the land, and the Memshala of Israel says, Jews, come and live here, then there's no longer Shelo Yalu B'choma. That's the argument that Rabbi Yisraeli says is one of the central flaws of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's tshuva. The Rabbi Ovadia says that Shelo Yalu B'choma still extant, and he cites from the Avnei Nezer that it's no longer the case, that is not the case. And he says that, moreover, even the Rambam, because according to some of the commentaries, the whole reason why the Rambam doesn't count this Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah is because of Shelo Yalu B'choma. So if Shelo Yalu B'choma no longer applies because the international community now gives us permission and invites us to live there, so then even the Rambam would hold that this now is one of the mitzvahs of the Torah. What? And the more people that go, then the more beautiful, the more glory is granted to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, and he furthermore argues, Rabbi Yisraeli, that once the nations have granted permission and have given autonomy to an Israeli state, an Israeli government, the United Nations or any other international entity cannot rescind that power. In other words, we're not attached to the UN by a string. You've granted us independence. This is his argument. You've given us the rights of self-determination. Now you can't tell us, okay, we're taking it away. Once the Israeli authority, once the Israeli state has the rights of self-determination, If the government says you can live in a certain place because we determine that that is part of our state, then nowhere where the Israeli government gives me a right to live can be qualified anymore as Shelo Yalu B'Choma, because we're now invited to live there. So even in disputed territory, if the Israeli government acknowledges that as part of Israel, or at least a place where Israelis may live, then it is perfectly, there is no more Shelo Yalu B'Choma, even in the Shtachim. Now, of course, it follows from this argument that if the Israeli government says you can't live there, so then there is a problem of Shelo Yalu B'Choma. Okay, but even then, okay, but there's still wiggle room, because Shelo Yalu B'Choma just says we can't go there en masse. But if an individual says, I'm going to be the rugged individualist and stake out my claim on a mountaintop, all right, that's not something that he discusses.
Yeah, but they were the ones that were encouraging them to go to the Shtachim for many years.
Absolutely. For many years, the Israeli government encouraged us. And therefore, that's Rabbi Israeli's argument. He says the government of Israel has designated these spots as places where Jews have a right to live. So therefore, Shelo Yalu B'Choma no longer applies to those areas, despite the protestations of the international community.
Does it make a difference what the nature of the Israeli government? In other words, does it have to be Das Torah, or is it just as long as it's Israeli government?
No. And by the way, the counter-argument to that is the Israeli government an legitimate governmental entity in the eyes of halacha?
Right.
Which we're not, of course, Rabbi Israeli doesn't challenge that, but you have to be thinking in the back of your mind, okay, so what does the Satmar say, right? Okay, but I'm just saying, in other words, there's more to this. I'm just presenting to you what Rabbi Israeli is presenting. Okay, the next part of his tshuva is one of those parts of the response where you just imagine him like giving this big krech, saying, you know, brothers and sisters, Yidden, fellow Jews, how can we even be discussing this nonsense? And he says, and this is the section where he talks about the obligation to thank Hashem for the opportunity to make Aliyah. He quotes from the Mishnah in Maseches Tainis, which says that Lo hayu yomim tovim liYisrael kechamisha asar ba'av u'chiyom HaKippurim. That the two most joyous days for the Jewish people during the Second Temple era was Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, and Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, Yom Kippur I understand because that's the day of Slicha and Kapara. Of course, we get atonement on that day. What a wonderful, joyous day to experience atonement. But what's so special about Tu B'Av? So there are a number of different opinions in the Gemara, and one opinion of the Gemara is, and this is in source number 7, Yom Shekalu Bo Meisei Midbar. It's the day when the Jewish people discovered that Jews were no longer dying in the desert. This was the last generation, the last year that the Jews were the 40th year when they were in the desert, and every year they knew that a certain percentage of their population would die off because all those who had left Egypt would not merit to go into Eretz Yisrael. And there was an expectation of a certain percentage of Jews to die on Tisha B'Av. And once the 15th of Av came and they saw that the moon was full and a certain percentage that they had anticipated would die did not die, they made a great celebration because this was now, to them, explains Rabbi Israeli, not just a tiding that people were not going to die, but it was now, because like the Gemara says, Ad shelo kalu meisei midbar lo haya dibur Moshe, that as long as the Jews who were destined to die before coming into Eretz Yisrael were still alive, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not speak to Moshe. And once it was revealed that no more death, anyone who's here today is going into Eretz Yisrael, God resumed his conversation with Moshe Rabbeinu, and then the Jews knew that imminently they were about to enter Eretz Yisrael. So part of the simcha, or really the main part of the simcha of Tu B'Av, was not just the fact that a percentage of Jews did not die, but also that this meant we're about to go into Israel. We're about to go into Eretz Yisrael. That was the great simcha of Tu B'Av. And if that's a reason to compare it to the simcha of Yom Kippur, so he says, brothers and sisters, how can it be that Jews today are not jumping for joy and in gratitude? The fact that we have the opportunity to make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, that we're invited to come and live in the land that we had been denied for 2,000 years. How is it possible that there are still Jews in the Golah that are not passionate about making Aliyah. That's, of course, you hear that. You hear the impassioned cry. And so therefore he says the day when Medinat Yisrael was established it should be as joyous as Tu B'Av, because that's the day when all Jews were called to come back to the land. Now, according to Rav Ovadia, the 3 oaths still apply to any contested area of Eretz Yisrael, specifically those that are beyond the green line. And that's what he quotes Rav Ovadia as having said in his tshuva. So Rav Yisraeli just questions it. He says, well, if that's the argument, then why just talk about the Shtachim? There are whole portions of Jerusalem that are also contested and are not recognized by the international community as being part of the official state of Israel. Even, he says, in a bit of a sarcastic fashion, he says, even our best friends in the United States do not acknowledge that the city of Jerusalem is part of Israel proper. They consider it an international city. And he says, if that's the case, then the prohibition of Shelo Yalu B'Choma should apply to Yerushalayim as much as it applies to the Shtachim. And not just East Jerusalem, not just the Old City, not just the Kotel, but even parts of Western Jerusalem as well. So this is part of his sort of Mimon Afshach. If you're going to go down that path that Rabbi Ovadia is advocating, then Shelo Yalu B'Choma applies to not just the Shtachim, but it applies to specific places in Eretz Yisrael as well, including Yerushalayim. Another point that Rabbi Ovadia had made, which actually we glossed over last week, we did not dwell time on it, but Rabbi Yisraeli chooses to dwell on this issue, is that Rabbi Ovadia puts forth an argument that one of the reasons why we should not be fighting and endangering our lives in order to preserve the Shtachim, in order to preserve the areas of the West Bank or Yehuda v'Shomron, is because today, in order to qualify something as a Milchemes Mitzvah, you need something that we simply don't have today. Rabbi Ovadia says that if you look in the Ramban, also in his commentary to the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, the Ramban also lists another thing that the Rambam left out. And that is, he says, in Mitzvah Yud Zayin of the Mitzvah Lo Saseh that the Rambam left out, the Ramban writes, in source number 8, he says, V'yesh li inyan mitzvah mistapek alai, v'hu she'yira'eh li, and he says, it's not 100% clear to me, says the Ramban, but it would seem to me that shemitzvah al hamelach o al hashofet, umi shaham birshoso, lahotziam latzava b'milchemes rishus o mitzvah lio shoel bu'urim v'tumim. That it is an obligation that before the king or the Sanhedrin tell a people to go out to war, whether it's a milchemes mitzvah or milchemes rishus. And remember, the Ramban defined a milchemes mitzvah as any portion of Eretz Yisrael proper that we can capture is called milchemes mitzvah. He says before the king or the Sanhedrin can tell the people to go out to war, they have to consult first with the Urim V'Tumim. The Urim V'Tumim had this miraculous quality to it that it would magically illuminate to provide an answer to the Navi or to the Kohen Gadol who would ask it a question. And V'alpiyam Yisnahig B'inyanam, and only under the guidance of the message of the Urim V'Tumim would then the people be allowed to go out to war. V'hu Amru Yisbarach, and that's why it says in Parshas Pinchas, V'lifnei Elazar HaKohen Ya'amod, V'shoalo b'mishpat horim lifnei Hashem, that the person who's going to go and take the people to war has to stand before Elazar the Kohen Gadol, and he has to ask him using the Urim V'Tumim. Al piv yetzuv, al piv yavo, hu b'chol b'nei Yisrael ito b'chol ha'ida, and therefore through the mouth or through the instruction of the Kohen Gadol, they go out to war, and through the instruction of the Kohen Gadol, they come back from war, and that's the way it has to work. And therefore it says, Yitzaveh b'Yehoshua shu ha'moshel harishon asher hu pakid al ha'ida she'ish'al b'inyanam b'urim v'tumim. It's very clear that Yehoshua is being commanded to consult with the Urim v'Tumim before he goes out to war. And if you notice in the underlined section, he says, "Umin halashon hazeh nireh shehid tzava adoris." It seems that this is a commandment that doesn't just apply to one generation, but it applies to every generation when there's a milchemes mitzvah. And he says, he writes, go to the next underlined section, V'hinei harav be'atzmo kasav b'hakdamas l'mitzvahs. He says, even the Rambam himself writes, in his introduction to the mitzvahs, he writes, Kelashon hazeh, as follows. V'yadua shehamilchamos v'kibush ha'aratzos lo yihiyeh elo b'melech uva'atzas sanhedri gedola v'kohen gadol. That we may not go out to war to conquer the land unless we have a king and the endorsement of the Sanhedrin and the Kohen Gadol. The Rambam himself writes that the king has to consult with the Urim V'Tumim. And the Ramban says quite emphatically is that it's a mitzvah, it's not just a suggestion, it's not just a recommendation, but it's an obligation, and it applies in all generations. And on that basis, Rabbi Ovadia had wanted to argue that there really is no such thing as a milchemes mitzvah. While it's true that one can say that in a milchemes mitzvah, you're allowed to endanger Jewish life, but if it's not a milchemes mitzvah, what right do you have to endanger Jewish life? So Rabbi Yisraeli asks the question, a very simple question. He says, if so, but then what right did the Chashmonaim have to go out to war during the Second Temple era when we know that the Urim V'Tumim no longer had their miraculous quality, as the Rambam himself writes, and we have it down, well, we won't even read it, in source number 9. And the Rambam writes that, actually no, I don't have this quoted by the Rambam. He says, but in Hilchos Malachim, the Rambam writes that the Urim V'Tumim no longer had their magical quality during the Second Temple period. So how could there be any war after which places Jewish life in jeopardy if there's no more Urim V'Tumim? So Rabbi Yisraeli says that this is a straw man, this is a straw argument, and therefore you have to say that it's only a mitzvah to consult with the Urim V'Tumim when the Urim V'Tumim are available. But if the Urim V'Tumim no longer exist, they're no longer available, so then the mitzvah no longer applies. Another thing that we had seen from Rabbi Ovadia that Rabbi Yisraeli addresses directly is that Rabbi Ovadia had wanted to argue that the mitzvah of kibush haaretz does not apply if after you conquer the land, you don't have complete autonomy and control over the land. So for example, if we conquer a portion of land, if we conquer Ramallah, and we make it part of Eretz Yisrael proper, then we haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of kibush haaretz because we have no control, because the Arabs are living there. They've got their whole communal infrastructure that is completely independent, and therefore that's not called the mitzvah of kibush haaretz. Kibush haaretz, according to the Rambam, Rav Ovadia had argued, is defined as our being able to have complete autonomy over the land. And to wit, the Rambam writes that when you fulfill the mitzvah of kibush haaretz, you have an obligation to obliterate avodah zarah from off the land. And claimed Rav Ovadia that if you cannot obliterate avodah zarah from off the land, then you're not really fulfilling the mitzvah of kibush haaretz, because you don't have that same sense of autonomy. Now that's the way that Rabbi Yisraeli quotes Rabbi Ovadia. I'm not really sure if Rabbi Ovadia was saying that exactly.
Avodah Zarah or the popular
Avodah Zarah. So if you recall from last week, Rabbi Ovadia had sought in a certain line of questioning. He says, is it permitted for us to allow Arabs to live in Eretz Yisrael? Bisman hazeh. And his argument was that you see very clearly from the Rambam that you're not allowed to let Avodah Zarah through your land. You're not allowed to allow Avodah Zarah when we have control over Eretz Yisrael. We are not permitted to allow Avodah Zarah to pass through, and certainly not to inhabit the land of Eretz Yisrael. And so then the question became, well, what if you have monotheistic Arabs who repudiate Avodah Zarah but are not Geirei Toshav, but have not accepted upon themselves l'shem, Shiva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, right, to observe the 7 Noachide commandments. So Rabbi Ovadia had indicated that there was a bit of a stira in the language of the Rambam between what he writes in the Yad and what he writes in Sefer HaMitzvos, and sort of left the issue open But he says, nonetheless, the whole prohibition of allowing idolaters to live in Eretz Yisrael is from the law of lo sechaneh, that you may not give, as the Gemara says, you may not give a chaniya bekarka, a foothold in the land, to idolaters. And the Rambam wanted to demonstrate from the Radbaz and others, he wanted to demonstrate that Isser of lo sechaneh is not really an Isser deoraisa, but it's only an asmachta, it's only an Isser derabanan, which is based loosely on a pasuk, but is rabbinic in origin. And as a result, he argued that as long as the inhabitants that you're allowing to live in the land of Israel, who are Gentile, are not idolaters but monotheistic, then we can allow Arabs to live in our land. But he says, if you allow them to live in the land, and you give them that sense of autonomy in their own cities and villages, then you no longer can fulfill the mitzvah of kibush in those places. So, using that line of reasoning, Rabbi Israeli challenges the whole premise, and he says, if that's true, that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of kibush haaretz, and since you can't fulfill the mitzvah of kibush haaretz in lands where Arabs live, how can you even justify endangering life to preserve the rulership of Israel over those places, if indeed we don't have control over Arab villages and Arab cities? Then why should we endanger life in order to take hold of them, since we're not fulfilling the mitzvah of kibush? That was the argument that Rav Avad put forth. So Rabbi Israeli says, he says, Mima nafshach. If you're not, he says, I don't understand why there should be only an Isser derabanan of allowing Arabs to live in the land. He says, it's far worse than that. If you're telling me that lo sechanim is an asmachta ba'alma, and then it's only an Isser derabanan to give a chaniya bakarka to allow non-Jews to live in the land, that's impossible according to what you yourself, Rav Avad, are arguing. Because according to what you've just stated, if I allow Arabs or any other non-Jewish group to live in Eretz Yisrael, I can no longer fulfill the mitzvah saseh of kibush haaretz. And if I am doing an act which prevents me from fulfilling a mitzvah saseh deoraisa, that's called being mevatel a mitzvah saseh. And being mevatel a mitzvah saseh is itself an isser. It's an isser deoraisa to be mevatel an aseh. And so therefore, mimon avshach. Either if you're going to tell me that kibush haaretz cannot be fulfilled in a land where you're allowing Arabs to live, then it has to be an isser deoraisa to allow Arabs to live there. And if you're going, the only conclusion therefore that Rabbi Israeli has to say is that no, you can fulfill kibush haaretz even when you allow Arabs to live in the place which you have taken control of. And therefore, the shtachim, which have Arab villages and have fallow lands, fall certainly under the mitzvah of kibush haaretz, and therefore we have an obligation, if you can justify pikuach nefesh, for a milchemes mitzvah, then you can justify it for the shtachim as well. And finally, there's another subject that we only touched on very briefly last week, which was called the border city. And again, which Rabbi Israeli spends a significant percentage of his tshuva discussing. There's a Gemara in Eruvin that says, talking about the laws of Shabbos, that Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Nachum Shetzaru al Ayaros Yisrael. It's a Gemara in Eruvin Daf Memhei. It's in source number 10. That if non-Jews take siege of a Jewish city on Shabbos, and Yotzin Aleim Bichlei Zainon, you're not allowed to carry your weapons out to fight with them on Shabbos. Ve'ein Machal Aleim Asa Shabbos, you're not allowed to be Machal Shabbos to fight against them. Tanya Nami Hachi, the Brisa says the same thing. But when is that true? When the Gentiles who are besieging your city are only coming in order to seize your assets, but your life, there's no threat to life. But if they're marauders who are coming to rape and pillage, then even on Shabbos you can go out and wage war with them, and do whatever you need to be machal Shabbos. Because of course, when it comes to pikuach nefesh, nothing stands in the way of pikuach nefesh. But if it's just an issue of them seizing your money, seizing your valuables, then you can't be machal Shabbos in order to fight them. But then the Gemara says, Uvi'ir hasmucha lasefer, But if you have a city that's a border city, and it seems it's referring specifically to Eretz Yisrael, but the Gemara will explain. Afilu lo bo al iskei nefashos ela al iskei tevin v'kash yotzin aleihen b'chlei zaynon u'machalulin aleihen es haShabbos. If you have a border city, then even if their claim is they only want to take a little straw for themselves, these armies, then you go out to fight with full intensity, even on Shabbos, and you're Machalol Shabbos, and you fight to the death. Now, what's the reason for that? Why is a border city different from a regular city? So Rashi on that Gemara in Eruvin says as follows. First of all, he says, what is an Ir HaSefer? He says, Ir Shemabdelis ben Gvul Yisrael leGvul HaUmas. A city that divides between the other nation and the land of Eretz Yisrael, or the border of the Jewish people. Yotzin aleihem shema yilkeduha. The fear is that they may take control of that city. Umisham tehinocha haaretz likavesh lifnehem. And then the rest of the land will become now easier for them to conquer. The Gemara, by the way, continues and it says that this halacha applies to all generations, because Amar of Yosef bar Minyumi, Amar of Nachman of V'chol, Ubavel rather, Ki Ir HaSmucha L'Sefer Damya. That the Jewish community in Bavel also has the status of an Ir HaSefer, of a border city. V'tirguma Nahar Da, because Nahar Da was at the forefront, was on the border between where the non-Jewish Babylonians were living and where the Jewish community was living. And if we would allow the anti-Semitic Babylonian entity, whether that was Persians or some other entity which is not clear from the Gemara, to be able to infiltrate Nahar Da'ah, then that would be a way for them to finally infiltrate all of the other Jewish communities in Bavel. It would be a dangerous threat. So you see that this halacha doesn't just apply to Eretz Yisrael, it applies to anywhere where Jews are living. If we have the ability to protect ourselves from even an army that comes under the pretense of just needing financial help, we're allowed to go out to war against them in order to save lives. This is codified in Shulchan Aruch, and it's in Hilchos Shabbos and Siman Shin Chav Tes, in source number 12. Akum shetzar al Ayaros Yisrael. If idolatrous armies take siege of Jewish cities, if they're just coming for financial reasons, we're not allowed to Machalol Shabbos to resist them. If they come, however, with the threat of taking life, and even if they just come without defining what their purpose is, we assume that it's a threat to life, and therefore Yotzim Aleim B'chlei Zayin u'Machalim Aleim. So Shabbos, we go out with our full weaponry on Shabbos, and we're Machalol Shabbos to fight them. Uve'ir hasmucha l'sefer afilu lo bo ela liskei tevin v'kash Machalol Aleim Shabbos. And this is true, says the Ramah, v'afilu lo bo adayin el rotzim. But even if you know that the army is about to come, they're imminently coming, you're allowed to go out and be Machalol Shabbos in order to fend them off. This is codified in Shulchan Aruch. It's a very clear halacha psuka. Now, Rabbi Ovadia, towards the end of his tshuva, had said that the Shtachim do not have the status of an Ir HaSefer. The Shtachim do not have the status of a border city, because you do not compromise, at least not according to many experts, he writes, you do not compromise the security of the state of Israel by giving certain portions of the Shtachim to the Arabs, because there is always the threat of a very powerful military and air force and airstrikes against the Arabs who would seek to infiltrate if we give them a foothold in the Shtachim. And it's on that basis that Rabbi Ovadia had made the following claim. He said that since giving them a portion of the Shtachim will avert an imminent war, the only other thing that you have to be concerned about is perhaps sometime in the future, because you have compromised in some sense the security of the borders of Israel by shrinking the state, shrinking the size of our borders, you will in some way compromise potentially sometime down the road the security of Israel and make it more vulnerable to future attacks. Rabbi Ovadia had said that that's not to be reckoned with in the face of imminent threats. And we had quoted, if you recall, the note of Yehuda last week, who had said the same thing in regards to autopsies. Rabbi Ovadia had quoted the note of Yehuda, which had said that we cannot justify performing an autopsy on a Jewish body that had died through a certain illness to save other lives down the road. And the note of Yehuda's argument was, because if you're going to be concerned about what he calls pikuach nefesh rechoka, this kind of distant form of pikuach nefesh, then it should always be permissible to a physician to be machal Shabbos and prepare medications and so forth, and got all of his medications prepared. Why? Because maybe there'll be a sick person who'll come along. So you see that the pikuach nefesh issue has to be imminent. And so therefore Rabbi Ovadia had differentiated between imminent pikuach nefesh, which is the way he defined the aversion of war by giving back land for peace, versus a pikuach nefesh rechoka, a distant form of pikuach nefesh, which is what we stand to enter into by giving back pieces of land, and therefore making the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael more vulnerable. So to that, Rav Yisraeli strongly disagrees. And he says, look, an Ir HaSefer is defined by the Gemara as a border city. Chazal did not differentiate and say that there are certain border cities and there are other kinds of border cities. He says the Shtachim very clearly are border cities, because once they get a foothold on those cities, it's going to allow them to infiltrate. And regardless of the military deterrent that Israel possesses now because of a very strong air force and army, well, the Syrians and the Jordanians and the Egyptians have also very strong deterrents. But that's going to be a wash. It's going to be neutralized. And therefore you still have to be concerned that this is going to cause even more harm to the state by giving back the shtachim. And he therefore says, and we also have to carefully define what is called a sakana krov and a sakana rechoka, a distant sakana versus a more imminent sakana. He says it's a mistake to think that imminent sakana is something that's happening right now, whereas a sakana rechoka is something that will happen in the far-flung future. That's not the definition. A sakana krova means that imminent means that there's a great likelihood that sakana is going to take place. If you have two sakanas, which are of equal likelihood of taking place, just one will take place more quickly and one will take place a little bit more in the future, then you can't differentiate between those two sakanas. What the note of Yehuda means by a sakana rechoka or pikuach nefesh rechoka is that there's a weak likelihood that by doing an autopsy on a patient, you're going to be able to say that it's too flimsy of an argument, too flimsy of a connection. The chances of that happening are so distant that we cannot justify doing the act of nivul hameis, of desecrating a corpse, in order to be able to do that. But if you knew for sure that you could save a patient's life by performing an autopsy, even if you won't be able to develop a cure for him unless you wait a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, then that's just as much of a pikuach nefesh as administering a cure to a patient than right here and now. And it's on that basis that Rav Yisraeli says there is no less sakana to the Jewish people by giving back land now for a temporary peace than there is by doing nothing and saying, listen, we'll take our risk, we'll take our chances, and if you want to come out to war against us, come out to war against us, we're going to call your bluff. The sakanas are equal, because there's a sakana by not giving back land, because they're going to say, oh, we're so angry at you, you give us land, we're going to have you out to war with you. And there's another opposite sakana, which is that if you give them back the land, they're going to infiltrate our borders, and it'll make Ashdod and Ashkelon and Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv and Haifa and Beersheba and all of the other cities so much easier to attack. And on that basis, Rabbi Yisraeli says better that we should not give back land for peace. And it's not just he says better, but he says it's halacha berura. It's mamish. And again, he's jumping up and down in his tshuva. I never saw him jump up and down, but the language jumps up and down. He says it's clear as day. Nothing could be more clear that Rav Ovadia is mistaken, and we can never justify giving back land for peace. That, in essence, is the tamtzit. I haven't said everything that he quotes, but that's the tamtzit of the tshuva. Any questions? Yes.
A quick question. The whole basis of the Gemara in Sugya the Tanai makes sense if you look at it from a logical point of view. If Jews can live in other lands, then don't en masse go and go back there to Israel. If you can live in other lands. When the first Aliyah was taking place, second Aliyah was taking place, it was Tsarist Russia, where Jews couldn't live. Yosef died, right? They were, or during the Nazi reign and all of the German Jews who were coming to Eretz Yisrael, that Tanai was no longer effective.
Okay, you can make that. So, and what about today? So I'm afraid that you're weakening the argument. You're not helping Rabbi Israeli. You're weakening his argument. You're suggesting that today, because we have the freedom to live in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe, then maybe the Shelo Yalu V'choma does apply. Rabbi Israeli is saying it's completely null and void.
Because first of all, Rov of the Jews are now in Eretz Yisrael anyway.
Okay, he doesn't. All right, so you're creating new arguments.
That's right.
But Rabbi Israeli's argument is bichlal. Once the international community voted in 1947 for a partition plan, and they said Jews can go to Israel, that's it. Game over. No more Shelo Yalu V'choma. Period.
Well,
Yeah.
but
I was saying, don't we worry about assimilation, even though it seems to be okay? That's a big problem, as we all know. So that's
Assimilate. Well, if you recall, we learned from last week's Gemara that the Gemara had said better to live in Eretz Yisrael, even if you're going to live in a city which is completely idolatrous, than to live in a city in Chutz La'aretz which is completely from. And so the assimilation ideal, while it is a concern, one could argue that there are plenty of places in Chutz La'aretz where you have a greater chance of not assimilating, because you live in a real starke yeshivish community, and you'll be fortified. Whereas you go to Israel, you never know, bad influences, da-da-da.
I also was wondering about the international community. They have an agenda, they're not legitimate judges.
I understand. Assimi.
But the other argument is that as soon as the Goyim broke their part of the Shua, then it's all bets are off.
Right. Rabbi Israeli doesn't mention that. At least I don't remember seeing that. But you're right. That has been an argument that's been put forth. Is that the third Shavua is that they won't be Mishtabed Yisrael Yoser Midai.
Right.
And once they broke that, then all bets are off. Now the question is, well, what if they only temporarily, like Alan was arguing, so what if they only temporarily broke the oath, and then they say, okay, we'll be nice again to the Jews. Does that Shavua now come back upon us?
No, because when it was broken, it was broken the Second World War. That's when the Midian was established.
So what about today? What about today?
But once you're in Eretz Yisrael, you certainly can't argue that.
Okay, but what about today? What about now conquering new land? What about Jews making Aliyah? Is there a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael today? David.
It seems to me that it's apples and oranges, and the lesson of the two classes we had was it's very dangerous to call something a halacha that is hypothetical. That Rav Ovadia is not saying, I'm ruling this is the halacha. He's just saying exactly the opposite. He's saying, if this situation were in such a situation, then this, and this. And Rav Yisraeli is saying, this is the halacha today.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you, and this is what we'll finish with, I'm so glad that you sort of framed it this way. This is exactly what Rabbi Israeli was coming to address. It's almost like he's saying, Chachamim hizaru b'divreichem, like it says in Pirkei Avos. Rabbis, be careful in your words. You, Rabbi Ovadia, had prefaced your words very carefully, saying this is an academic discussion. But you know what? You don't put something like this out in the public sphere, or something so volatile, which is clearly going to be absconded and used for political purposes. And Rav Ovadia probably, and almost you're reading almost the accusation that Rav making. Come on, my dear friend, you knew that they were going to do this, didn't you? Right? And therefore you shouldn't have. Therefore I have no choice but to respond and say in the strongest of halachic practical terminology that never give back land for peace. So you have two different, very, very different views. Two very, very different views, and two views that these are not, when it comes to halachic issues, sometimes things are academic and we can look at them coldly and very analytically and very removed from the situation. Here, of course, this is a situation which we all become passionate about, because either we, our family, or we know someone who's living in Israel, who faces the threats, who gets frustrated by what sometimes goes on in the international community and even within the state, the government of Israel itself. And these halachic issues intermingle with real life politics, and we have to try and sort of absorb what the words are and see if we can find some level of balance at least, or at least of understanding. Okay, we'll hold it here for tonight. We'll daven Myra.